Okay, let's go over homework 10.6. Shifts in graphs again. We're looking at horizontal, vertical shifts, and some reflections over various domains for sine and cosine. So for graph number 1, I'm just going to list out some important information on the right-hand side here. I have an amplitude of 2. I have a midline shift of y equals 2, which means I have a range that would have gone from -2 to 2, but because of the shift up to, my range is going to be from 0 to 4. Okay, I have a frequency of 2. That's the value being multiplied outside of my horizontal shift. I have a period of 2 pi over 2. 2 pi over the frequency is always period, so my period is pi, which means my critical value interval is period over 4. So period is pi, so critical value interval is pi over 4, which just means that the tick marks along my x-axis are going to have pi over 4 units between each one, which is equivalent to 45 degrees. Now, my domain is going from -pi to pi, so the actual critical values that I'm going to put on my x-axis, I'm going to start at -pi, I'm going to go all the way to +pi. I'm going to think, okay, if I start in the middle, similar to a question we did yesterday, I would start by going over 1 pi over 4, then 2 pi over 4, then 3 pi over 4, and then I left myself just enough room because pi is really 4 pi over 4. So then I just need the same values with negatives in front going the opposite direction. So -pi over 4, -2 pi over 4, -3 pi over 4, and then this is -4 pi over 4, which is just -pi. So those are the values I will label my x-axis with. Let me set up my axes since I'm going to the left and to the right of the y-axis here. Since I'm plotting both positive and negative x values, I'm going to put my y-axis, as close to middle as possible. And my range is going from 0 to 4. So technically I could put my x-axis all the way at the bottom. So why don't I just do that? I'm going to put it all the way at the bottom since we don't need to go below that. Okay. Now as far as y values go, I'm going to skip 2 boxes. So my range is going from 0 to 4. And then for my critical values for x, I need to put 4 values on each side. So I'm just going to skip 2 boxes. Pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 is really pi over 2. You don't have to simplify. 3 pi over 4. And then pi. Or 4 pi over 4. Again, if you don't simplify, it's completely fine. Just going to put in the negatives. And then we'll get to graphing. -3 pi over 4, -pi. Okay, now I have a few transformations that are occurring here, so I'm just going to list them over here. This graph is being reflected, which means for cosine, it's going to start at the min. Okay, it's also going up 2 units. So let's place our midline at y equals 2. Okay, and it's also going left pi over 2. So at -pi over 2, I am going to draw in a vertical line for that shift. So I'm just going to highlight my shift lines. Okay. All right, so for cosine, if we're going to start at the minimum, typically we would be on the y-axis. Its minimum value is 0, so we would have been at the point 0, 0. However, we are also shifting left pi over 2. So my first point for cosine is going to be at the point -pi over 2, comma, 0. So this point right here. Now, if that's my starting point, cosine would then go at its next critical value. Again, when we talk about where the curves go from their starting point, we're always talking from left to right. If you have to plot something to the left side of that, I always do that after I work from left to right. So if we're starting at the minimum at negative pi over 2, comma 0, we're now going to go to the middle. So at negative pi over 4, the next critical value, we're going to come up to the middle, which is at 2. Then this curve from there, the next critical value would be 0. So I'm going to go up to the maximum, which is 4. Then at my next critical value, come back to the middle. Next critical value, back to the minimum. Next critical value, back to the middle. Next critical value, back to the maximum. Now, because I have to plot more than just negative pi over 2 to pi, I am going to go back to my starting point now and think about, well, what would it do on the other side of this? So if this is a minimum point, whether I'm going to the right or to the left from a minimum, these curves go from minimum points to the middle. So I am going to go to the middle here, a negative 3 pi over 4. And then because this midline point just came from a minimum, if I'm going to negative pi now, I have to go up to the maximum, which is up here at 4. Okay, so now I'm going to start sketching this. I'll start at my starting point. Again, just trying to make it a smooth curve. Okay, let's take a look at the second graph. So for this curve, we're plotting sine. The amplitude is 3. There is a midline shift of y equals negative 1. So that's my midline. My range, instead of being from negative 3 to 3, we're going down 1 from that. So my range is really negative 4 to 2. Okay, then my frequency is 1. So my period is just 2 pi over that, or 2 pi, which makes my critical value interval 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. And because my domain is going from 0 to pi, I'm going to label my x-axis 0, 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2. Well, I can stop there because that is pi. So these are the only numbers I'm going to have to put along my x-axis. Now, before we move on from here, we want to think about where do we put our axes. So if we're plotting all positive values for x, and the horizontal shift is going right, so I don't even have to think maybe I have to go to the left of the x-axis, to the left of the y-axis and go on the negative side for x just to think about my horizontal shift. I'm going to put my y-axis all the way to the left because I don't have to do anything to the left of it. Okay, my range is going from negative 4 to 2, so I need both positive and negative values for y. I'm going to put my x-axis a little higher up because I need more negatives than positive, but again, if you put it in the middle, that would be fine too. So let's see if I have enough. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you know what? I'm going to move my x-axis. You do not have to do this, but I'm going to move it up so I can fit 2 boxes for every unit. Okay, so here's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4. There's my minimum. Here's 1 and 2. And then if you want to think, here's 0. Okay, so now what I need to do is think about my x-axis. I'm going to skip 4 boxes. Here's my pi over 2. And I'm going to skip another 4 boxes. Here's my pi. My midline shift is negative 1, so I'm going to plot that line with a dashed line here. And I'm going to go right pi over 2 for my horizontal shift and also plot that. Again, these are just to help you visually when you go to sketch. You Don't necessarily have to have these plotted, but I do think that they are extremely helpful when you go to graph. So as far as my starting point, sine always starts in the middle, and there's no reflection. Oh, we didn't list our transformations. So we're going down 1 and right pi over 2. So even though sine starts at the middle, which here is -1, it is starting at the middle going right pi over 2. So here is sine's starting point, the point pi over 2, comma, -1. And that's a direct relationship to these transformations where the starting point is. Now, there's no reflection, so that means sine would go up to its maximum at its next critical value. So its maximum is up here at 2, so I'm going to plot that. Now, I don't go beyond that because of my domain stopping at pi, but I do have to go to the left of this point since my domain starts at 0. So where would sine go from the middle? If on the right side of that middle it went up, that means on the left side it would go down to its minimum. So if I sketch going right, this is the start of my sine curve, but because I'm also going this way, I'll plot in both directions of that middle. So because of the domain, this is all we're going to see of this curve. Okay. Some of you started submitting this homework already, which is also why I wanted to make this video, because I saw a lot of common mistakes on number 3. So for number 3, this function is not written in standard form. Here, let me make standard form general. So amplitude value times the function. The frequency is always outside of any horizontal shift, and then the midline shift. So what's not happening on this curve is this frequency and this horizontal shift right now are all intertwined. So I need to factor that out. So I'm going to factor out the 2, but when I divide away or factor out that value, I have to do that from both values in this parenthesis. So 2x divided by 2 is just 1x, and that's what I want. I want the coefficient of x to be 1 so that I know what the horizontal shift is. So when you divide by 2, really is the same as multiplying by 1/2, which is helpful with fractions. This is going to become pi over 4. So as far as the frequency is still 2. That doesn't change. But what is changing, and what this question is asking, is what is the horizontal shift? And a lot of us put pi over 2 to the left, but that's not correct because that isn't the horizontal shift since the frequency was not factored out. It's actually going to the left by pi over 4. Okay, and for this last question, you are asked to state the values of A, which is amplitude, B in this case is frequency, and D is the midline shift. And then to write an equation of this function. So I'm going to say this now. You will never have to write an equation or assume there was a horizontal shift. Okay? So you never have to write or assume, right, a trig equation with a horizontal shift. Okay, so that means I can always look right to my y-axis and ask myself, okay, is the y-axis, is the y-intercept a maximum point for this graph, a minimum point, or a middle point? So I can see that this graph is starting at the max, which means it has to be cosine. Okay, now if it has a maximum of 4, now we need to identify where the minimum is, and the minimum is -2. So amplitude is always going to be half their difference. So 4 minus -2 means the overall distance of this curve is 6. So half of that is 3, which means the amplitude of this curve is 3. So they asked me to define A. Well, now I have A. So we did that part. Now, for the vertical shift, for D, I think that would be the next easiest thing to do. Let's go and find the middle. So if we come down 3 units, 1, 2, 3, from the max, or we go up 3 units from the min, 1, 2, 3, we meet at the middle, which is positive 1. So the D value is 1. That's the midline shift. All right, and now we're ready to identify B. So from a graph, especially if you don't see 2 pi on the x-axis, it's always easier to identify the period, because if you can see one cycle, you can always identify period. So this graph finishes its first cycle at pi over 2, which means that's the period of this graph. And remember, we also have a formula for period, which has frequency in it. So if I'm looking for B, let's set up an equation now. Pi over 2 equals 2 pi over B. And let's solve. Okay, so we get 4 pi is equal to pi times B. Divide away the pi to get that this frequency is 4. All right, so I identified my A, my B, and the D value. This graph started at the max, so there's no reflection. So as far as the equation, this would be y is equal to, the amplitude was 3, cosine, the frequency is 4, and the midline shift is 1. Okay, guys, I hope this homework review was helpful, and I will